I wore a black suit and a white shirt, a black tie and black shoes, all polished and shiny, clothes that would normally make me feel uncomfortable, as if I were in a stolen uniform or pretending to be an adult. Today they gave me a comfort of a kind. I was wearing the right clothes for a hard day. I had done my duty in the morning, spoken the words I was meant to speak, and I meant them as I spoke them, and then, when the service was done, I got in my car and I drove randomly without a plan. With an hour or so to kill before I met more people I had not seen for years, and shook more hands and drank too many cups of tea from the best china. I drove along winding Sussex country roads I only half remembered, until I found myself headed toward the town centre, so I turned randomly down another road and took a left and a right. It was only then that I realized where I was going, where I had been going all along, and I grimaced at my own foolishness. I had been driving toward a house that had not existed for decades. I thought of turning around, then as I drove down a wide street that had once been a flint lane beside a barley field, of turning back and leaving the past undisturbed. But I was curious. The old house, the one I had lived in for 7 years, from when I was 5 until I was 12, that house had been knocked down and was lost for good. The new house, the one my parents had built at the bottom of the garden between the azalea bushes and the green circle in the grass we called the fairy ring, that had been sold 30 years ago. I slowed the car as I saw the new house. It would always be the new house in my head. I pulled up into the driveway, observing the way they had built out on the mid-70s architecture. I had forgotten that the bricks of the new house were chocolate brown. The new people had made my mother's tiny balcony into a 2-story sunroom. I stared at the house, remembering less than I had expected about my teenage years. No good times, no bad times. I'd lived in that place for a while as a teenager. It didn't seem to be any part of who I was now. I backed the car out to the driveway. It was time, I knew, to drive to my sister's bustling, cheerful house, all tidied and stiff for the day. I would talk to people whose existence I had forgotten for years before, and they would ask me about my marriage, failed a decade ago, a relationship that had slowly frayed until finally, as they always seem to, it broke. And whether I was seeing anyone, I wasn't. I was not even sure that I could. Not yet. And they would ask about my children, all grown up. They have their own lives. They wish they could be here today. Work, doing fine, thank you, I would say, never knowing how to talk about what I do. If I could talk about it, I would not have to do it. I make art. Sometimes I make true art, and sometimes it fills the empty places in my life. Some of them, not all. We would talk about the departed. We would remember the dead. The little country lane of my childhood had become a black tarmac road that served as a buffer between 2 sprawling housing estates. I drove further down it away from the town, which was not the way I should have been travelling, and it felt good. The slick black road became narrower, windier, became the single-lane track I remembered from my childhood, became packed earth and knobbly bone-like flints. Soon I was driving slowly, bumpily, down a narrow lane with brambles and briar roses on each side. Wherever the edge was not a strand of hazels or wild hedgerow. It felt like I had driven back in time. That lane was how I remembered it, when nothing else was. I drove past Caraway Farm. I remembered being just 16 and kissing red-cheeked, fair-haired Callie Anders, who lived there, and whose family would soon move to the Shetlands, and I would never kiss her or see her again. Then nothing but fields on either side of the road for almost a mile, a tangle of meadows. Slowly the lane became a track. It was reaching its end. I remembered it before I turned the corner and saw it in all its dilapidated red brick glory, the Hemstocks farmhouse. It took me by surprise, although that was where the lane had always ended. I could have gone no further. I parked the car at the side of the farmyard. I had no plan. I wondered whether, after all these years, there was anyone still living there, or more precisely, if the Hempstocks were still living there. It seemed unlikely, but then, from what little I remembered, they had been a very unlikely people. The stench of cow muck struck me as I got out of the car, and I walked gingerly across the small yard. To the front door. I looked for a doorbell in vain, and then I knocked. The door had not been latched properly, and it swung gently open as I rapped it with my knuckles. I had been here, hadn't I? A long time ago? I was sure I had. Childhood memories are sometimes covered and obscured beneath the things that come later, like childhood toys forgotten at the bottom of a crammed adult closet. But they are never lost for good. I stood in the hallway and called, "Hello? Is anybody there?" I heard nothing. I smelt bread baking and wax furniture polish and old wood. My eyes were slow to adapt to the darkness. I peered into it, was getting ready to turn and leave, when an elderly woman came out of the dim hallway, holding a white duster. She wore her grey hair long. I said, "Mrs. Hempstock?" She tipped her head to one side, looked at me. "Yes, I do know you, young man," she said. "I am not a young man, not any longer." "I know you, but things get messy when you get to my age. Who are you exactly?" "I think I must have been about 7, maybe 8, the last time I was here." She smiled then. "You were Letty's friend, from the top of the lane?" "You gave me milk. It was warm from the cows." And then I realized how many years had gone by, and I said, "No, you didn't do that. That must have been your mother who gave me the milk. I'm sorry." As we age, we become our parents, live long enough, and we see faces repeat in time. I remembered Miss Hempstock, Letty's mother, as a stout woman. This woman was stick-thin, and she looked delicate. She looked like her mother, like the woman I had known as old Miss Hempstock. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see my father's face, not my own, and I remember the way he would smile at himself in the mirrors before he went out. "Looking good," he'd say to his reflection, approvingly. "Looking good." "Are you here to see Letty?" Miss Hempstock asked. "Is she here?" The idea surprised me. She had gone somewhere, hadn't she? America? The old woman shook her head. "I was just about to put the kettle on. Do you fancy a spot of tea?" I hesitated. Then I said that, if she didn't mind, I'd like it if she could point me toward the duck pond first. Duck pond? I knew Letty had a funny name for it. I remembered that. She called it the sea, something like that. The old woman put the cloth down on the dresser. "Can't drink water from the sea, can you? Too salty, like drinking life's blood. Do you remember the way? You can get to it around the side of the house. Just follow the path." If you'd asked me an hour before, I would have said no. I did not remember the way. I do not even think I would have remembered Letty Hempstock's name. But standing in that hallway, it was all coming back to me. Memories were waiting at the edges of things, beckoning to me. Had you told me that I was 7 again, I might have half believed you for a moment. Thank you." I walked into the farmyard and went past the chicken coop, past the old barn and along the edge of the field, remembering where I was, and what was coming next, and exulting in the knowledge. Hazels lined the side of the meadow. I picked a handful of green nuts, put them in my pocket. The pond is next, I thought. I just have to go around this shed and I'll see it. I saw it and felt oddly proud of myself, as if that one act of memory had blown away some of the cobwebs of that day. The pond was smaller than I remembered. There was a little wooden shed on the far side, and by the path an ancient heavy wood and metal bench.